So here we are for Text on Tuesday, our third and final session because scheduling dictates this outcome. Our third and final session on Text on Tuesday's Guide of the Perplexed, and we'll cover some Guide of the Perplexed and we'll cover some of Maimonides' broader legacy, if you want to call it that. It's a many-layered thing. So to just recap, as our goals, we had said, we'll examine representative sections of the guide, gain an understanding of some of the details of Maimonides' thought and approach to Judaism and Jewish texts, and gain an understanding of important aspects of Maimonides' thought for the history of Judaism and for humanistic Judaism. And we hit on a lot of those topics last week. So recapping that, just quick overview, we talked about the structure of the guide, or the lack thereof, the intended audience, Maimonides' overall intent behind the guide, which maybe is clear and maybe is not. We talked about the limits of the rationalist label, the idea that his approach to biblical interpretation is sort of a challenge to the ideas in Rashi's commentaries, and the reason he talks about how he's going to write contradictions into the guide, right? So that was really our first shot at the guide, and we looked at 18 pages worth of stuff, and that was it, because the introduction is actually really important. Our second session, we started looking at how Maimonides talks about interpreting the biblical text and rabbinic texts as well, particularly when they are about things that don't make a lot of sense. And his answer tends to be, oh, there's something else going on, and the problem is you don't understand how to read the text. We also sort of talked about his esotericism, the idea that what I'm telling you isn't really meant to be broadcast. It's specialized knowledge, it requires specialized expertise even to begin to understand, and I only give you drips and drabs as appropriate. And how that affects what the reader is supposed to know and how we're supposed to approach the guide, what concepts he thinks people can learn depending upon their limited intelligence, and what limits have to be placed on the limits themselves. So he says it's very difficult to understand the idea that God, as he understands God to exist, is utterly and completely and radically different from everything else in the universe and is utterly unique and utterly one. And that's very hard to understand, but we can do it through biblical texts, and we have to teach people that so they don't go the wrong way in their beliefs. And we also sort of discussed that Maimonides turns out to be, according to Kabbalists, an important step into Kabbalistic Judaism. So while Maimonides' project, at least later in his life, looks like it's some kind of philosophic effort, that philosophic effort is viewed by Jewish mystics as being necessary to then take a step into the world of Jewish mysticism as they have constructed it. We talked about whether Jewish philosophy is the right name for what Maimonides is doing, and I suggested that we're really talking about theology and not philosophy, and that colors how you then read Maimonides and every other person that's called a Jewish philosopher, because this carries over. It's not just Maimonides, it's Judah Halevi, and it's later thinkers. So Martin Buber, this affects Martin Buber, this affects Franz Rosenzweig, this affects Hermann Cohen, who we'll talk a little bit about later today. This affects that entire project. And we talked about to what extent the limits that Maimonides recognizes are limits that maybe we have too, to what extent science may be limited in its ability to give us understanding of the natural world. Are we really all that different from Maimonides? Because our neurology is not really all that different from somebody living in the 12th and 13th centuries. So this was really the last section that we had left that I titled, So What is God Anyway? Maimonides really does explore in the Guide of the Perplexed the length and breadth of Aristotelian philosophy in all kinds of different ways. where he takes a step back and advances something that's not particularly Aristotelian, is in talking about theology proper as anybody would understand it. So when talking about what is the nature of God and things like that, Maimonides is a little less enthusiastic about Aristotle. And so it's worth looking at why that might be. What is it he thinks that's going on that can't be described, that can be described? Why does he break from Aristotle here? And what does that say about the limits Maimonides sees in the ability of Greek philosophy to really be matched up with Jewish thought as he understands it? And so Roberto earlier this week sent out a link to a video that was unfortunately all in Hebrew, and I've been looking and they don't have an English captioned version of it yet. It's from a show called, in English it translates to "The Jews Are Coming." In Hebrew it means "The Jews Are Coming." I mean, it's not, I'm not mistranslating it. It really does mean "The Jews Are Coming." And they're little vignettes. They're always little humorous vignettes about some piece of Jewish legend or Jewish history or whatever. And this one happens to be about Maimonides, who is accused in the video of peddling left-wing trash. And they burn the Guide of the Perplexed in the marketplace and say, we live in a free country. We're free to shut anyone's mouth we want. This is very obviously a comment on modern Israeli politics that's happening, but it could also be a comment on our politics too, just as easily. And part of the reason that they reject him right off the bat is he says, oh, I showed that Greek thought and Jewish thought are compatible. Well, Maimonides doesn't necessarily think that. And his discussion of God, the God of the Bible, is one of these places where we can see he doesn't fully think Greek thought and Jewish thought can be reconciled. So Maimonides is probably most famous in the world of philosophy and in philosophy of religion for something called the via negativa. Via negativa is a Latin phrase that just means path of negation or negative path. And as Maimonides expresses it, it's the idea that we can't really understand what God is, and the words that humans use to talk about God don't really describe God. Maimonides' explanation for this is really tied into his idea that God is radically singular and radically other and removed from, but somehow part of the universe that we live in. It's a very kind of complicated thing. And it's useful to know that this isn't unique to Maimonides. So if you spend all of your time in Jewish studies circles, you might be forgiven for thinking Maimonides came up with this. But this isn't really unique to Maimonides. Within Jewish thought alone, Philo of Alexandria, dating to the 1st century, talks about this as well, and is writing, interestingly, for some of the same reasons that Maimonides writes. He has these modern educated people who know Greek philosophy, who think Greek philosophy is onto something and are embarrassed in some ways by what's in the Hebrew Bible. And they want some way of reconciling what's in Judaism to what's in Greek philosophy. So this is Philo of Alexandria's enterprise. Jews mostly don't know about Philo until the 1500s, the 1600s, because Philo is written in Greek. Jews aren't reading Greek. It was used heavily by the church, which automatically gives you sort of a, yeah, we don't want to read this. So Philo does this, but Philo is writing in Greek and he's not really taken up by Jewish philosophers for quite a long time, which is to say, in my opinion, Jewish philosophers, i.e. Jewish theologians. The Bahir is one of the major works of Merkava mysticism, of the version of Jewish mysticism that exists prior to Kabbalah. The Bahir does this kind of thing too. And Maimonides' primary translator, Samuel ibn Tibbon, himself writes some theological treatises and uses the via negativa. And of course, he's citing Maimonides, but he's also thinking for himself. And these are just three examples within Jewish texts. We know as well that Islamic philosophers use this. We know as well that Catholic theologians use this, notably Thomas Aquinas, with some modification. Thomas Aquinas got the idea by reading Maimonides translated into Latin and reading the Islamic thinker Averroes, again, translated into Latin. And they both use this via negativa, and he brings it into Catholic thought and has to adjust it in a number of ways. But he's starting from these sources from Maimonides and other non-Christian sources. So the via negativa, to talk about it before looking at this upcoming text, the basic idea of via negativa is that you can't say what God is. And so what you do when you attribute a characteristic to God is you are saying, in essence, God isn't the opposite of this attribute, or the effects of God's actions are not the opposite of this characteristic or this attribute, which is a logical set of backflips. And we'll see how Maimonides talks about it, but it's useful to kind of have it in our language, what it is he's doing, before we read it in his language, because as I pointed out, the translation is a little bit stuffy and highfalutin in how it presents its English. And fundamentally, we have to know up front that Maimonides actually thinks we can't really know a ton about God. And that's because, in his view, God is an absolute unity. So he says, if you belong to those whose aspirations are directed toward ascending to that high rank, which is the rank of speculation, you've learned Torah and you want to be a philosopher, and to gaining certain knowledge with regard to God's being one by virtue of a true oneness, so that no composition whatever is to be found in him and no possibility of division in any way whatever. This is a really long sentence. Then you must know that he, may he be exalted, has in no way and in no mode any essential attribute, and that just as it is impossible that he should be a body, it is also impossible that he should possess an essential attribute. If, however, someone believes that he is one but possesses a certain number of essential attributes, he says in his words that he is one but believes him in his thought to be many. Unless you've studied this before, you probably don't know what just happened. So Maimonides is saying that from his perspective, there is a God. That God is one. There is one God, and that God is totally and utterly a unity. There's no sense of division. There's no sense of plurality. There's no sense of any kind of break in that unity. And that unity is completely unlike anything that exists in our world. And Maimonides thinks that when you describe something, when you can give it characteristics, and so you say, person X is tall, person X has brown hair, person X is intelligent, that what you are doing is you're actually showing that that person is not all that unique. So there may be one of that person, but that person can be compared, and that means that there are multiple things that are true about that person. And from his perspective, God can't be like that. So you can't really say God is necessarily one. That's not even meaningful to Maimonides. You can't say God is good, because that would mean that there are other things in the world that are good and God would be like those things, and that means that you can compartmentalize something about God. I'm not asking you to accept that that's reality. I'm simply saying that this is Maimonides' reality. And so he says, if you believe that, if someone says, I believe that God is one, and God is good, and God is beneficent to humans, and God is, right, and starts to list these things. He actually thinks God is many. That's Maimonides' kind of last sentence. If you are able to apply positive things to God, that's not a unified God. Barry says, sounds like these are his axioms. Yeah, except axioms don't take this many pages. I mean, he is working from the principles, the 13 principles that we'll actually get to talking about farther down the road today, but he's further expanding on this because conceptually you can say these things and not really know what they mean, and he's trying to explain them to a philosophically minded audience. So we have to know that Maimonides thinks whenever you try to say someone or something is X, you are also saying that they cannot be radically one and other. And for Maimonides, God has to be radically one and radically other. And so you can't just assign names and think that that's the reality. If you do, Maimonides thinks you're a heretic. He also thinks that everybody can understand this, and that left to our own devices, we actually would understand this. So he says, if man had been left as he naturally is, he would not have needed a proof, wouldn't have needed to be proved that God is radically other and radically one. For instance, the existence of motion, the existence of man's ability to act, manifestations of generation and corruption, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yet since strange opinions have arisen due either to people who've committed errors or to people who have acted with some end in view, the men of science have had to resort to proving those manifest things and to disproving the existence of things that are only thought to exist. Thus, we find Aristotle establishes the fact of motion as it had been denied and demonstrates the non-existence of atoms. Guess who's wrong about that? As their existence had been asserted. To this category belongs the denial of essential attributes to God, may he be exalted. So Maimonides thinks that there are primary intelligibles, basic concepts that if undisturbed and in its natural state, the human mind understands. And one of the things he thinks the human mind understands is the idea that God is absolutely a unity and absolutely other and absolutely one and absolutely indescribable. So Nadine says, what about the places where God is described as walking around and talking and doing things? Well, Maimonides' answer to this is always going to be that text is an allegory and it's getting at something else. Always, always the answer, right? It's a very convenient answer because, of course, he can always shift the terms of the debate, but that's his answer. And the more far-fetched the story, the more the story is really likely to be some kind of an allegory. So he does acknowledge, oh yeah, there's these stories about God walking around in the garden. That's not what it means because nobody thinks that's what it means. You shouldn't think that's what it means. God doesn't have a body anyway. That's always his answer to the really ridiculous stuff, or what we see from a logical perspective as pretty ridiculous stuff. So God is radically other, God is radically singular. Any attempt to apply a characteristic to God essentially divides God's being, and that can't be right, so we can't do that. When you say God is good, you can't possibly be saying God is good. So Jack, you've got a hand up.
Well, this sort of reminds me of the book of Job and God from the whirlwind. So the book is all about an argument over whether God is just, and then God arrives on the scene and says, wrong framework, I'm God. Forget about that attribute. Am I on the right?
Yes, there is actually a discussion in one of Maimonides' works about how Job is actually absolutely the right way to look at theodicy and the question of divine justice. I can't at the moment put my hand on that text, but he does actually talk about it. Oh yeah, you should definitely read Job. Job makes sense of all of this theodicy stuff. Laura.
Yeah, so I mean, I do think that what he's saying is pretty radical, because if no one can describe God or attribute to God any characteristic, then, and if you accept that premise, then how do you go about even like trying to figure out what God wants you to do, how you're supposed to behave to honor God or to follow His commandments? So if you accept that premise, then it's very hard to sustain the religious edifice on top of it.
Right. So Maimonides has, we're going to kind of talk about this. Maimonides has his explanation of how this all actually is supposed to work. Because he does think prophecy is real. He does think that we can use language to talk about characteristics of God, but what the language does is a specific thing. So Maimonides says the big error that everybody makes is by taking scripture at face value. And he says, look, the reasons that lead people to believe in the existence of attributes are akin to those that led those who to believe in the doctrine of his corporeality to that belief. You weren't led by intellectual speculation. You looked at the surface text of the scriptures, and it says God was walking through the garden. God is good. God is merciful. And you got to the conclusion that that's a true statement about God. He says that's wrong. That's not how you're supposed to read the text. And remember, when we started out with the guide, we spent a lot of time talking about how Maimonides was going to talk about people misunderstanding biblical language. And this is absolutely core to everything he's doing throughout the guide. And we're back to it, right? He says, look, you read it wrong. You have to read it the right way. And once you read it the right way, you understand how all of this stuff is supposed to work. So he says, look, right off the bat, when people say God is good, God is merciful, whatever it is, they're making a mistake of language by looking at the effect of a natural process that is spun off by God's actions, looking at that end result and saying that that end result tells you that God is good, or that God is merciful, or that God is powerful. He says it's not that any of that is really true, but we see the effect of divine action, and we say that was an act of mercy, therefore God is merciful. And he says that's not really right, but we speak in human language, and this is kind of what we say. And he says the sages call them characteristics and speak of the 13 characteristics. This term, as they use it, is applied to moral qualities, not that he possesses moral qualities, but he performs actions resembling the actions that in us proceed from moral qualities. I mean, from aptitudes of the soul. The meaning is not that he be exalted possesses aptitudes of the soul. It thus has become clear to you that the ways and the characteristics are identical. So this is Maimonides saying, first of all, when you say God is merciful, you're not saying that God has the characteristic of being merciful, but God does stuff, and the effects of the stuff that God does are merciful. And when we say thing X, we really mean thing Y. So Barry says, isn't performing actions a characteristic? Yeah, but Maimonides is already speaking in analogy anyway. So he's going to say, look, I'm using human language. I can only go so far. Right? He is trying to get across that we can't fully understand how any of this stuff works. And part of not being able to understand it is we're going to use language that's really bad. And it just can't be made to square up with the reality. The reality is like, whoa, when you start to pull it apart. That's his take on it. I don't have a better way of explaining it. This is like radical awe, radical transcendence, radical whatever. This is Maimonides' approach. is simply to say, this is just so different that anything we say isn't quite right. We're only sort of grappling with the edges of the reality. And this is the language that we're stuck with. We're humans, we're limited. Roberto.
Yes, so it's I think what more or less what Barry was mentioning in terms of those actions. So he is saying he doesn't associate any attributes as we think about attributes to God, but he does associate actions, right? So more specifically, like creation, right? Does he accept the fact that God created the universe the way, maybe not on the allegoric sense that described in the Bible, but there is a process in which the universe was created, and somehow there is this God that was associated with the creation of that universe, but maybe not with the decision process of how we would imagine a person, I'm going to create this, but there is some kind of unity that occasion or caused, or how is that how is he, I don't know if he describes anything specific. I know that you talked a little bit about that cosmology, but I don't know if he got into the specific of God and the creation, right?
Yes. So he does, and what he says, so some of you have probably heard of the prime mover theory. We should call these things hypotheses. These aren't theories like real theories, right? They're hypotheses or philosophical ideas. And Maimonides subscribes to that idea. Maimonides says that there has to be a cause to the things that exist, and the cause to the things that exist is God, kind of doing something that sets things in motion, which doesn't mean that we are supposed to think that God decided hippopotamuses should exist, so much as God set a bunch of natural processes in motion, and the natural processes that result, you get hippos, for example. And not that God is, so all of these ways that we have of talking about what creation would be and how that process would work, all of these are just really feeble human attempts at wrapping our minds around what's real, quote unquote real, from Maimonides' perspective about what God is and what God does. And we can only really look at the world around us and say, oh, I see there are hippopotamuses, so God is the maker of the hippopotamus. Oh, I see that merciful things happen, God is merciful. That's the best we can really do, is to make a statement like that and somehow tie it to God, but we really don't get this right. I mean, he really does say, we never get this right. Michael. Probably need to unmute.
What you just described was just classical deism, right? The idea is that God is the creator and then turns aside. And that's like one micro step from atheism. I mean, classically, no one couldn't imagine that the world, the universe created itself. So you imagine the creator, and then to get away from the God concept, they said then he went away. That's what a deist was. But that's not really what but the real point I wanted to raise was picking up on what Laura said about the commandments. So if God has no attributes, why in Maimonides' view must we follow the law? And more specifically, why are there rewards and punishment? How, I shouldn't say why, but how, if God isn't continuing to act as with the attribute of justice, which would be an attribute, then why are there rewards and punishments, specifically after death, for acting in a particular way or not acting in a particular way?
This is a good question, and it makes an assumption that I think we shouldn't make. Or I think, to put a different way, Maimonides is trying to shake us of a particular way of thinking about Judaism. And Maimonides wants to shake his readers off of the idea that there's a tally board out there with mitzvahs you did and mitzvahs you failed to do, and we tally them up at the end, and you are rewarded or punished for the extent to which you did these things. That Maimonides, when he starts the Mishnah Torah, starts by talking about love of God, and that being what's fundamental to following the commandments, not that there's reward and punishment. Now, we're accustomed to thinking about reward and punishment, and as a side note, if you've read stuff about Maimonides, you know that he also talks about the idea of reward and punishment. But we've also seen in the Mishnah Torah and in the Guide of the Perplexed, rather, that he actually kind of does think that you need that carrot and stick thing to get regular people to do stuff. So he has a different perspective, and his perspective kind of comes down to, he does believe that there is prophecy. He does believe that stuff somehow, through some divine action, through some process we don't understand, popped into Moses' head. And that was the Torah. And he says, I don't understand how this works, just like Spinoza 600 years later will say, prophecy happens. I don't really understand it, but it does. So Spinoza's not saying in that respect anything that Maimonides didn't say before. Maimonides says, I'm not sure how this works, but it does. And God is so radically other that we can only just sort of attempt to say that stuff. So can you pray to that God? Maimonides thinks yes, because you still love that God, right? And his take on the purpose of understanding science and understanding creation is understanding that this is the product of God's behavior. This is the product of God's actions, radically other from what we think of when we take action, right? So we always have to kind of put this footnote that he knows he's using language that is totally inadequate to the task, right? And this is why I sort of suggested maybe you need to think of Maimonides as a little bit of a mystic, because there's an awful lot in Maimonides' purportedly philosophical, rational stuff that really boils down to, whoa. Like the kind of discussions that people have in college dorms at like 2 in the morning, right? This is the kind of stuff that Maimonides is thinking in his head. And it's the only way for us to sort of start to scratch the surface of what's going on in his opinion, is to understand that we are inadequate to the task of really understanding what's happening. We have words, we try to put words to it, but we need to understand how inadequate our words are so that we don't believe the stupid things coming out of our mouths. That's really what's going on with Maimonides when he's talking about language of talking about God. And it's really, really difficult because traditional Jewish texts talk about reward and punishment. Maimonides is like, not really.
Well, Maimonides in the Mishnah Torah over and over again says, if you do this, you will suffer karet, right? Death at the hand of heaven. There were punishments, specific punishments. Your soul, karet is, I guess, your soul was cut off from your people. Then there's a different punishment, death at the hand of heaven. And he describes what karet is. What he says it's the ending of your soul, your actual soul. And he gets in trouble there because he kind of denies that there's resurrection. But he talks very specifically about specific punishments. Now, if you're going to say he's a mystic, I would interpret that as meaning God is not inflicting those punishments. Those punishments just occur because that's the way the universe is constructed, like as a principle of physics. Because to me, that's what a mystic is, someone who doesn't say that there's an external force doing these things. These kind of magical things occur for what they would think of as scientific reasons. You know, that's the way the universe is constructed. But he absolutely talks over and over again about specific punishments for specific actions after death.
Right, and so Roberto points out in the chat, the consumers are different. right? So the Mishnah Torah is aimed at everybody. And Maimonides has said most people aren't smart enough to understand this. So we need to give them the traditional carrot and stick so that they behave themselves. And everybody else needs to do that. We philosophical elite can talk about how we understand that this isn't true. And he's thinking about this even as he's writing the Mishnah Torah, and that's why he gets in trouble with the Mishnah Torah. And I've got some stuff on that farther down in the PowerPoint too. But Joyce, you've had your virtual hand up for a while, so I want to make sure.
I just wanted to go back to what Michael talked about briefly. Does he believe in this kind of deity that created everything and then turns off from it?
No. So he believes that there are natural processes that occur as the result of divine action, and there's order and there's rules and all of these other things. He doesn't think about God as separate and independent and checked out from creation, because he also understands that we're not using language the right way. I mean, this is sort of this is the problem with the guide, right? This is really the problem with the guide of the perplexed at bottom. This is what makes it so hard to understand and to work with, is Maimonides is continually hedging his language and explaining that we can't really know this stuff, and any language we use is just a grasp at an attempt to begin to describe stuff, which means that the response is always, well, we're getting it wrong, we're getting it wrong, we're getting it wrong. We're saying these things, but really we're so inadequate to the task of explaining these things that all the language we use is inadequate. So I talked last week about Moshe Idel's lecture, where he talks about that there are 6 or 7 Maimonides. I don't know how to pluralize Maimonides exactly. He kind of says, like, there are 6 or 7 Maimonides, and really what you need to think about is that Maimonides evolved over time and becomes kind of radically skeptical at the end of our ability to really say anything true. And this is the putting of that to paper. So he's not really thinking of it as a deist. He thinks that God is the continual reason for the processes that happen in the world, but he knows he can't get at what that is. And he knows that our language is just inadequate to the task, right? That's his take on it, is we can't truly say anything real. And that's why he starts talking about this via negativa, this, well, you say the opposite. And so this is really part of the text that sets out what he thinks is happening. He says, look, more obscure than what preceded. This is Maimonides saying, oh, by the way, I know that what I'm about to say is really obscure, and everything I said before is also really obscure, so hold on. And he says, this is more obscure than what preceded. Know that the description of God by means of negations is the correct description, a description that is not affected by an indulgence in facile language and does not imply any deficiency with respect to God in general or in any particular mode. On the other hand, if one describes him by means of affirmation, one implies, as we've made clear, that he is associated with that which he is not and implies a deficiency. I must make it clear to you in the first place how negations are in a certain respect attributes and how they differ from the affirmative attributes. After that, I shall make it clear to you that we have no way of describing him unless it be through negations and not otherwise. You can only describe the stuff by being in the negative. You say God is good, and what it means is that God is not evil, and you're describing the effect of God in the world somehow. That's it. That's Maimonides says that's all we can really do. Anything else is untrue. The immediate response is, well, isn't not evil also an attribute? Right? There's no good way of doing this. Maimonides is doing the best he can from his perspective, but he knows all of our language is inadequate to the task that he's trying to explain to us, which is, from his perspective, God is so radically other. All of this stuff we're saying, we don't really know. All of this stuff we're saying is an attempt to get at something that we can't fully know and we can't fully describe. And we have to tie ourselves in knots in order to be able to start to talk about it, even to start to talk about it, because he's not going to tell you he has the authoritative take. He's going to tell you that the language turns itself upside down, and this is what we're stuck with. That's really what he's getting at. And it's what he's been getting at the whole time with language. He really says up front in that introduction, everything I'm going to talk about is really about language. And it takes reading and reading and reading and reading to realize he's not kidding. That everything rises and falls on the way you use language to talk about these things, and he knows our language is just inadequate. That's really what's happening here. And that's what makes the guide so darn hard, is because you can look at some other point in Maimonides where he says people suffer for sin. Okay, how does that work? Because you just said that we can't understand any of this. It really is exactly as confusing as I'm making it. And that's one of the huge challenges about this book, is he's guessing too. He truly is guessing. He just sounds a lot more certain than he probably really is. So David, you have your mic open.
Yes, so I think we have to go back and, for me, understand what does he mean when he says God is oneness? Does oneness mean the attributes that are within human beings? If they have moral attributes, is that what we mean by the oneness of God? It's so elusive to me. What does he mean by that?
It is elusive. So this is really, really important to get our hands around. Maimonides is constantly saying, you know, God is radically one and radically other, and also our language is inadequate to the task. Maimonides is really admitting that he can't tell you, that this is just something we can't fully understand, that we can't wrap our hands around, that God is so radically other that the words we're using really aren't adequate to the task. And there's no way of getting around that problem. All we can do is try to approximate. So that's part of the infuriating thing about this, is when you say, oh, God is good. Well, okay, what does that mean? Well, God's not bad. Okay, well, what does that mean? So God is one. What does that mean? Even saying God is one is ascribing an attribute, so that really all you're saying to Maimonides is God is not plural. What does that mean? It is infuriating because the language is not, our language is not suitable to get to the concept Maimonides has in his head. And that is also part and parcel of mysticism too, is the idea that the language is not adequate, that you use the language to kind of enter these altered states where you kind of go, oh, wow, I get it now. But you can never say it when you have to say it. And Maimonides admits that, right? He's been talking this whole time, the last 3 or 4 weeks, we've been talking about him saying there are these flashes, and you get these little flashes, and the mystic, the person who speculates, occasionally has these flashes, but then they can never really fully explain what it is. This is everywhere in the guide, and it's in the introduction, and it's in the Mishnah Torah, and it's everywhere. He talks about teaching in flashes and teaching only the chapter headings because you can't get the details. This is what's happening in the guide. This is why the guide is so hard. This is why you can't actually understand what's going on in the guide, because Maimonides doesn't have a way of putting in language what's in his head. So Peter says, from Aristotle in college, he's referring to a first cause and a final cause. So Maimonides is basically saying that God is the basic cause, and that's all we can say. Does this make him philosophical? I'm not even sure Maimonides is saying that that's something we can say. He's just so constantly careful about saying that I can't really give you the language, that what we're saying is never really going to be adequate to the concept underneath, and that you, if you are really truly enlightened, you will have these flashes where you understand stuff, which is kind of not how philosophy as we understand it is supposed to work, that you sort of have these boom flashes that you can never describe again, right? That's the opposite. That's not what philosophy is supposed to be doing. Philosophy as we understand it is really supposed to be putting into words and explaining rationally the world around us. And it's not possible. Maimonides is saying here, it's not possible to do that. Ami, you have a virtual hand up. But
yeah, I missed last week, so I may be I may be running into something that's been discussed. But you mentioned before that Maimonides does say that you would suffer if you sin, if you will suffer. My question is, does he say that God would inflict suffering on you? Because maybe it's a concept more of like how mitzvah. If you do something good, it's for the heck of doing something good, and then you'll feel good. And if you do something bad, then you'll feel bad about it.
so he doesn't say that. He does actually say God pay, this is in the 13 Principles of Faith, that God repays righteousness with righteousness and evil with evil, according to its degree. So we then have to stop and go, wait, but he's talking about all of this stuff, and then he's saying the language is inadequate. So I think we have to maybe take it on faith that Maimonides is taking it on faith that some kind of thing like this happens, but we don't know how. That's the best we can really get at with Maimonides. And he realizes that there are things he has to say in straightforward language because there are people who are not going to be able to really understand, who are not really going to be able to have those moments, those flashes where, you know, he talks about the idea that sometimes there's light that reflects off of a stone and it illuminates us for a second, and that's us. That's our ability to apprehend all of the stuff that's happening. Whereas Moses, the lightning was always going off, and so it was like Moses was always in the light of day. And we simply are not able to reach the level of understanding we have to have except in these flashy little moments, and they go away and we can't put those to words. So if you asked him, he would say, I think it works out that way. I don't really know. And I don't know how it works out that way. I don't know. It's a mystery, man. I mean, I think really deep down, he has to be saying, I don't know. But it's supposed to work out somehow, but I don't know. I don't know. I don't have words for this. I mean, I really think that that's where the guide leaves us, is I don't have words for this, but I think maybe it works like this. Larry, you've got a mic open.
I don't mean to.
Oh, okay.
Thanks.
I mean, this is kind of brain melty stuff, right? So, okay, so I'm trying to figure out who has, so I see Roberto, Ami, and Michael all have virtual hands up, but some were open before, so I can't tell what's real and what's not exactly. But Michael, I know that your hand was down and now is up again.
When he says God is one or a unity, is it possible that he's saying that God is, as Spinoza would say, God is everything?
It's possible. The only pin to put in that is that he does say as well that God is radically other. And Spinoza, when Spinoza gets into his pantheist mode, which really happens in the ethics more than it does in the text that we looked at, the political theological treatise, when he says that, he is really saying God is like in everything and is everything. And that doesn't seem to be Maimonides' language, which makes it even more complicated because now we have no analogy to hook it to, right? Barry, you've got a mic open.
Yeah, does the punishment happen in this world or the next, number one? And the other question is, am I independent of God and therefore not part of his unity? And is that a characteristic of God, that I am not part of his unity?
Sure. So it's not, Maimonides is, the plain language Maimonides uses is that you will be punished at some point by God if you do bad things, and you will be rewarded if you do good things, and there is going to be a resurrection, and.
Oh, he has a resurrection, okay.
Right, so he does say all of this, but then he's also saying, but I can't give you attributes, and I can't give you, the point of the guide is really to put a question mark on everything so that you continue in your speculation, and it's not going to give us, we're not going to get answers from this thing because it's not written to give us answers. It's written to make us question literally everything, because that's the stage. This is Moshe Idell's take on it, is this, by the time you get to the end, the stage in his life and thought that Maimonides is at is, I'm not really sure about any of this stuff, which is why there's contradictions in the guide, because he's changing his mind throughout his life, and he's not really sure by the end of the stuff he was very confident about 30 years before. So really is difficult. And there's, I could try to give you an answer, but Maimonides would say, oh, I think so, but I don't know, because all of our language is inadequate to this, and I only see in flashes, and I can't fully explain the flashes. We actually read stuff in the introduction that says I can't explain the flashes. So we're stuck, right? We can look at all of this other stuff that Maimonides wrote, and he seems to be saying these things, but then if you read the guide and you realize that he's trying to really, 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 really deter you from thinking that what you're saying is true, how do you know that he believes what he's saying in those other places? It's very difficult. It may be that he had some radically other concept. He understood something that he could never get down on paper, which he wouldn't be the first person to be in that position, right? Ami, you have a hand up.
I already asked my question.
Oh, okay. Okay, well then, I will lower your hand for you. Okay, so Larry, your mic is open.
Yes.
Okay.
I don't know if this is worth anything to anyone, but I literally can't stop thinking of a parent saying to a kid, if you do this, you'll get an ice cream cone. And the kid says, okay. And he does it, and he says, where's my ice cream cone? And the parent says, oh, I didn't mean a real ice cream cone. You know, when you're a parent, you'll understand. And it's just, it's very hard for me to get past that and be in an accepting posture to Maimonides, although I admire him.
I mean, so yeah, so I think it's okay that we may not be in an accepting posture with Maimonides, right? Because look, he's writing 800 years ago, and he's trying to write about stuff that he knows he can't fully put words to, and he can't. He's telling us over and over he can't really communicate this. Yeah. That the enlightened person will read this and will read it over and over and over and over, and it will guide them to their own understanding. I can't give you this stuff. I can't really say it, no matter how hard I try.
I like his humility, and I don't get the feeling that he's trying to, do a power trip. Make me believe. But
yeah, you're already supposed to. Yeah, you're already supposed to be on his level, kind of, when you're reading this, and that's difficult.
Yeah,
that's difficult. Laura, you have a virtual hand up.
Yeah, so trying to understand. So where is he coming from, or what is he trying to achieve? So if it gets to that, if the arrival point is not, it still is full of uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
what is he trying to argue against, or what is his project at this point? Because at least when we were talking about Spinoza, and you explained that he had a certain objective, or he was arguing against a certain stand. Particularly, I think you mentioned some Protestant churches at the time, and so he had an agenda, if you will, and in this case, it's not clear to me what is it that he's trying to achieve, or is he merely struggling with his own questions and challenges.
He may be struggling with his own questions and challenges. I think what he's struggling with for himself is getting the stuff that he thinks he knows into words that are useful. But his purpose isn't really, he's not writing for an audience other than people like himself, and saying, you've studied Torah, you've studied philosophy, and you realize that there is huge mismatches. I'm going to try to describe how everything matches up, but I have to tell you that the language is inadequate, and I can only give you little bits and pieces so that you can, through your own speculations, get to the right answers, to the ability that your intelligence limits you to getting there. He's not trying to win a political argument. He's not really trying to persuade tons and tons and tons of other rabbis, even, because he says all these people who've just studied law, they're not adequate to this book either. That it's a really specific person, a really specific kind of person with a really specific set of abilities and interests, and he's just trying to point people in the direction of having the kinds of flashes he thinks you need to have to understand what he thinks is true. That's really all he's trying to do here, I think. There are other scholars who would say, you know, he's trying to disguise an atheist agenda. That comes up as a potential thing that Maimonides is trying to do. I don't know if I buy that. I do think he's been clear. He's been very open. You only get these ideas in flashes, and I can't take the flashes and put them into words. I can only give you the chapter headings, right? And that's his way of saying, I can only kind of communicate to you the words that I have to describe what actually happened in my head. And what actually happened in my head, I can't describe. I'm trying to lead you to have the same flashes in your head, the same moments of realization in your head as I had in mine. That is, I think, really, truly all he's trying to do, except you see how complicated that is, that this is, in English, this is 1,300 pages where he's using the vocabulary he has. He is an Aristotelian. He thinks that that's probably right based on observation of the world around him, except, of course, remember, he's wrong about atoms. He says atoms don't exist. He's certain atoms don't exist. And he says, Aristotle proved atoms don't exist. Oh, really? So it's what he sees, and he thinks it's right based on observation, and he's trying to get you to the point where he got to. And I think that's really all he's trying to do, except you see how hard it is for him to actually do that, that the language isn't adequate to that task, that the thoughts, the philosophical schools, all of these things, you can engage with all these things, but you can't really get there without it happening in your own mind. And we're stuck with a work that's what it's trying to do, I think. And that makes it incredibly infuriating because we want answers. And he is open in the introduction about saying, I'm not going to give you answers. I'm trying to give you little flashes so you can get to answers in your head. And that's the best my language can do. And so can you pray to that God? I don't know. He thinks you can. But he doesn't really fully explain how. So yeah, it's absolutely incredibly frustrating and confusing. And he's open about it from the beginning. So I don't know, take that for what you will, I guess. Barry, you got a hand up?
Yeah. He wants so badly to believe in God, but he knows he can't even come close to describing what that belief is or to proving it. And I think that's what's reflected in the density of the text and the resort to mystical ideas. I think for me, the issue then is, okay, at best I can understand a little bit about what he's trying to do. And I agree that he has an impossible task, but then what is his location in history? So what's the problem that he's trying to solve? Or that, how did he advance rational thought, shall we say, in the sequence to what was before Jewishness and then bringing us to more modern Jewish ideas?
Well, so I think we should talk about this. What is Maimonides' legacy? Because, we could go down the via negativa stuff all day, but it doesn't,
Right.
You're seeing the language doesn't get us anywhere. So we sort of talked at one point about the idea that Maimonides is trying to rationalize Judaism somehow. And you can see this through the Mishnah Torah in particular, where he reorganizes Jewish law and he says, look, I'm going to bring Greek science in, and that's how you describe the universe. And you need to be able to describe the universe and understand it to be able to love God fully. Right? That's what's happening in some of the Mishnah Torah. He wasn't particularly successful. We have to say right off the bat, he wasn't successful. By the end of the 15th century, the philosophical Aristotelian moment in Jewish thought is done. The last kind of holdout is a guy named Isaac Abravanel. Isaac Abravanel was not himself actually a philosopher in the sense that Maimonides was, but he's the last person working with Aristotle and talking about Aristotle as the philosopher and all of this other stuff. So to the extent that Maimonides is trying to rationalize stuff, this piece of his agenda fails. We have to say it fails. So he writes the Mishnah Torah and he reorganizes all of Jewish law, and he is immediately met with incredible resistance because you didn't cite your sources and you reorganize things, and sometimes you're wrong and you're reflecting your own personal practice or the practice of the region that you're in, and it's not the whole world. And also, what's with this Greek stuff that you've decided is part of the Torah? You say you're giving us the oral law. Now you're also saying that Greek science is part of the Torah. So there was so much pushback on that you have to say that that program failed. The Guide of the Perplexed was always going to be kind of a failure in an exercise in persuading everybody else, because it was never meant to persuade everybody else anyway. It's an esoteric work that limits its influence, it limits its accessibility. Relying on Greek thought makes this an uphill struggle because the Greeks are the bad guys in rabbinic texts. He gives these apodictic statements, right? Dogmatic statements. This is the way it is. And he doesn't cite his sources and he doesn't prove it. So that gets rejection. He's got to argue about too many different possibilities. Maimonides' project is really doomed. Nevertheless, Maimonides has this huge imprint on Jewish life for the next 800 years, right? There's the saying, from Moses to Moses, there was no one like Moses. The first one is Moses, Mount Sinai Moses, and the second one is Maimonides. So it's still far-reaching. The Mishnah Torah is really the first code of Jewish law, an attempt to just have statements about what the rules are. And even though it doesn't become the way you organize Jewish law, it still becomes the starting point for an awful lot of Jewish legal interpretation. His scholar-philosopher model is influential for lots of people in Jewish thought, particularly non-Orthodox, but some Orthodox ones too, right? So modern Jewish thinkers sort of look at Maimonides as a role model. He's bringing in Greek thought and he's bringing in Jewish thought. He said, oh, I have these 13 principles and this is what you need to have in order to really be Jewish. And people said, you can't say that. And yet it's in the prayer books today. And it was in the prayer books 500 years ago. So the rationalizing of Judaism didn't happen. And yet Maimonides' fingerprints are all over the next 800 years of Jewish life. So his version of Judaism is not the version of Judaism that develops. And that project is probably doomed to start with. But that doesn't mean he didn't have huge influence. He shapes everything that comes after, just not the way he wanted to shape it. I think that's the fairest way of characterizing what happens with Maimonides. So David, you've got your mic open.
Oh, yeah. No, I was going to say, speaking of his effect, you talk about you talked about his influence on Merkava mysticism.
Mm-hmm.
So would it help? Does it help? Maybe I'm taking you in a direction that's you don't have time for now. But if we look at Merkava mysticism and work backwards to Maimonides, would that be of any help? Would that help to explain him somehow?
It might explain some of what he rejects, because he does really reject the idea that God has a body, and Merkava mysticism really does think there's some kind of a physical form to God. It illustrates some of what he's pushing against, but I don't know that that's the primary thing he's responding to in every case. So it's hard to say. And the reality is, reading Merkava mysticism is really, it's weird stuff. I mean, I can't think of any better way to put it than it's weird stuff. We saw the stuff where God is 236 million parasangs tall. Really? I mean, Kabbalah is weird. Merkava mysticism is even weirder. There's 40 names of God, and you meditate on them, and it's all very, very seemingly non-rational stuff. So I'm not sure that it would explain anything, and it might be more confusing if we actually sat and looked at Merkava stuff like the Bahir. I've never been able to wrap my head around that stuff in any credible way. So I do have to say that's a limit for me, is I just don't know. So, we could kind of look at the Mishnah Torah as an example of where things start to go askew, because it's a little bit more accessible to us, right? We talked about there's Greek philosophic concepts, and there's errors and all kinds of other things. And the reception to Maimonides is largely negative in his own time and shortly after. And this person is a useful person to know about. This is the Ravad of Pasquier, which is modern day Vauvert in Provence. His name is Abraham ben David. He's called the Ravad because that's Rabbi Abraham ben David, Ravad. Yeshivish folks, I've said, call him the Ravad or the Roivod. I've mostly heard Roivod because of how Ashkenazic vowels work. He's also called Baal Hasagot, the critic. He criticizes Rashi, he criticizes Maimonides, he criticizes several other people. His thing was writing commentaries that are critiques. And Maimonides has these 13 principles of faith, and one of them is that there will be resurrection to eternal life. And then in the Mishnah Torah, he says, the world to come, there'll be no form or body. Instead, there are only souls of the righteous without a body, like the ministering angels. And Ravad says, every comment the Ravad makes on the Mishnah Torah, he says, Abraham says, this is him, the words of this man are very near to one who says that there is no restoration of life to the dead except for their souls. And as my own mind lives, this was not the opinion of the sages of the Talmud. Perhaps instead it's possible the Creator will grant various creations bodies like those of the angels, and the body of Elijah may he be remembered for good, and the crowns will be just as the literal words mean and not some kind of allegory. Ravad is very insistent. No, there will be physical resurrection. Maimonides is wrong. And I'm going to say so in my commentary on Maimonides, right here. Maimonides says that people who say there is one God, but that he has a body, have no share in the world to come. Ravad says, but why are you saying that? How many people went this way, believed this? And the implication is, how many people better than you read the Tanakh and saw that there will be physical resurrection, primarily in the book of Daniel, and still more who read Aggadot from the rabbis that talk about this, the idea that God has a body. God walks in the body, you know, God walks through the garden. God has a body. You can't say that this is heretical. So he's actively working to say Maimonides is wrong. Maimonides is wrong. Maimonides is wrong about his ideas that there's no physical resurrection. Maimonides might be wrong that God has no body. And he actually talks about Maimonides not citing his sources. And he says, Maimonides writes in his introduction, in order that no one should need ever to write again concerning the laws of Israel. That's the point of the Mishnah Torah. You don't ever have to write another halachic text. I've got you covered for all the practical stuff. Ravad says, oh, he thought to decree, and then he didn't do it effectively because he left the path of all the writers who came before. They brought proof. And they said the people who said the things, and he doesn't do that. And maybe he has some difference of opinion, but we can't really tell why. And I don't know whether I should rely on anything that's in the Mishnah Torah because I don't know why he's saying what he's saying. So this is the Ravad saying, I see you've done this amazing thing. I don't trust you because you didn't cite your sources and you don't explain yourself. And I found errors in here. And I found statements that don't work. And understand this is within, 20 years of the Mishnah Torah being written. Ravad is already pointing out all these problems. So when I say Maimonides' project was bound and determined to fail, it was going to fail, and it was going to fail quickly, and the Ravad proves it. Roberto, you have a hand up.
Right, but coming back to the concept of the legacy, right? What it really means to fail, right? I mean, coming back to everybody knows who Maimonides is, but who knows who is Ravad, right? So maybe Ravad was right in all the commentaries that he made to him. But at the end of the day, right? And again, let's be conscious of, how big was the Mishneh Torah? It was also a pretty big undertaking, right? So
Yeah.
I'll be surprised if he didn't make any mistakes on trying to reorganize, restructure, and do whatever he was doing, right, to try to establish that as a code of law. So the fact that to this day people are studying and taking, this Mishneh Torah as, this is not small influence, right, what it has today. So I don't know if fail would be applicable to kind of that, on pragmatic terms, trying to look at his situation, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So what Maimonides wanted to have happen is not what happened. But that doesn't mean that Maimonides wasn't incredibly influential in the breach, right? And he is incredibly influential in the breach. So we see Solomon Maimon names himself after Maimonides, right? This is a name this guy chose. Moses Mendelssohn points to Maimonides. Herman Cohen, who is a Jewish neo-Kantian, who I can't really recommend that you read, but I have read almost everything he wrote that's translated into English. I'm not going to suggest you do that. The last Lubavitcher Rebbe loved Maimonides because the last Lubavitcher Rebbe had an engineering degree, and he thought of himself as like Maimonides because he's a man of science. None of these people are Aristotelians, but the fusion of Judaism with outside thought was fascinating to them and motivated them. And modern Orthodoxy's idea of Torah u'madah, of Torah and science, and this is actually the slogan at Yeshiva University, this is inspired by Maimonides, right? So he lost all of these battles, but in a way, he won this huge war. Michael, you've got a hand up.
Just picking up on what Roberto said, even the law itself, if you look at the Shulchan Aruch, which is considered to be definitive, or kind of the most definitive, I guess, code of Jewish law, I think about a third of it is taken word for word from the Mishneh Torah, something like that. So huge amounts of what he wrote were, were sustained by the tradition.
Right. And what's interesting about the Mishneh Torah is sometimes he's quoting rabbinic text, but again, he doesn't cite his sources, so you don't know.
Right.
The version of the Mishneh Torah that I have, I don't have a volume of it in front of me, is actually one that's been commented on by Adin Steinsaltz, the same guy who does the Steinsaltz Talmud and all that other stuff, and the citations are in there so that you can see all the places he got stuff from. But the original Mishneh Torah didn't have it, and that was a break, right? That's a break from the usual protocol.
But other people have put the citations in.
Right.
You can go now, the Yale translation has all the citations in it. So
right. Yeah. So you can find all the stuff that he was talking about.
The other thing I wanted to say about resurrection, my understanding is that was a big blow when he did deny, as you quoted, the bodily resurrection. And my understanding is he ended up writing a book just on that topic, explaining how deep his belief in resurrection really is.
Yeah, he kind of had to do some backpedaling, and this is one of these areas where Maimonides' writing is actually really influential day-to-day traditional Jewish practice. So Maimonides is in the Siddur twice a day, essentially. So there are two texts that are encapsulations of what Maimonides wrote in a commentary to a particular section of the Mishnah, where it's a chapter of the Talmud called Perek Chelek. So Chelek means portion in this particular case. And Perek Chelek is everyone in Israel has a portion in the world to come, except these 5 types of people. And Maimonides sets forth 13 principles that give you what your beliefs have to be to get into the world to come. And that longer comment is turned into a poem called Ani Ma'amin. So Ani Ma'amin be'emunah shlema. I believe with perfect faith that there is one God, that God is eternal and outside creation and singular and right, all these things. And then there's another text that is really more poetic, the Igdol. So the Igdol Prayer, this is the conservative movement Shabbat prayer book. This is Igdol at the end of Friday night Shabbat services. This is the Reform movement's current Rosh Hashanah prayer book. This is Igdol. Almost the same. They change one thing, and the thing they change is, in the original Igdol, the last verse is Metim Yechaye El Barov Chazdo Baruch Adei Ad Shem Tehilato. The dead God shall bring to life in the greatness of his righteousness and his great righteousness. Blessed forever and ever is his praiseworthy name. So this is a text interpreting Maimonides as saying the dead will be restored to life. The Reform movement tweaks only this line, as far as I can tell, and it says Chaye Olam Nata B'Tochenu Baruch Adei Ad Shem Tehilato. So they don't even change the second half of the last line, but the first line, the first half of it, they say, eternal life you have implanted within us, right? So they aren't willing to say, oh, the dead will be restored to life, because that's like not the Reform movement's thing. But in every other respect, the 13 principles of faith that Maimonides sets out that's in the Igdol prayer is in the Reform Rosh Hashanah prayer book. So nobody like Moses. By the hand of your faithful prophet, you gave the house of Israel a Torah of truth, right? These very, very orthodox things are in the Reform prayer book. And they got them from Maimonides. So this is 800 years of undeniable influence, but not the way Maimonides wanted to have his influence, right? So that you can't control history and the outcome is different. What's his legacy? His legacy is all of this stuff, not the one he actually wanted to have, which was, we don't have to study Talmud like this anymore. And we can understand things more rationally, and we can restructure Jewish law, and all of these things that he wanted to have happen, those things didn't happen. And instead, we have this incredible sort of wild inheritance from him that you couldn't have predicted at the time. So, I mean, that's sort of, because Maimonides is so difficult to read in the Guide of the Perplexed, there's no way of controlling how things are received, but the incredible impact he had is really stunning for a guy who actually, compared to a lot of writers, didn't write all that much stuff. I mean, he wrote a bunch of stuff, but it's not like he wrote a commentary on the Talmud and a commentary on the Torah and a commentary on, right? He didn't produce like Rashi produced, but he's still an incredible amount of stuff. Michael, do you still have a hand up?
Well, I'm just going to, somebody mentioned in the previous week about his books being burned. This wasn't just an intellectual controversy. There was an anti-Maimonidean and an anti-Maimonidean factions, and they were really emotional, and what's going on in Portland is similar to what would have been happening then. This is not just some esoteric bunch of rabbis. Is that right? I mean,
they did burn his books, and there were kind of practical implications. I don't know if it's quite Portland. But I think the controversies are possibly overblown because of what they were about. So at the end of the day, Maimonides' practical rulings in the Mishnah Torah aren't really all that far off from anything else that was happening at the time. He's not wrong a lot, and what he's wrong on isn't actually, most of the time, rubber meets the road changes in Jewish practice. So yeah, they were significant, but you almost want to, so there's this thing called the Streisand effect, right? The idea that if you really want to get your stuff out there, something that you can do is be very controversial, and everybody talks about it by saying you shouldn't listen to this person, and of course everybody then listens to this person. Well, if you spend 100 years fighting over what's in the Guide of the Perplexed, which you've already seen is really not comprehensible stuff, if that's what you spend 100 years fighting over, guess what everybody reads? They read the Guide of the Perplexed, or they read the Mishnah Torah, or whatever it is. So having 100 years worth of controversy guarantees Maimonides a legacy, which is of course not what these people were trying to do, but it's what they accomplished. So yeah, it was serious, and people were excommunicated from communities and all kinds of other things. But the end result of that is probably preservation of a bunch of stuff that we might not know otherwise. Because if everybody had just accepted Maimonides' take on things, maybe we wouldn't care about the Guide of the Perplexed so much. I don't know. Okay, so we are at the end of the PowerPoint slide, I promise. I also know that quite possibly a lot of brains have melted down by now, which is, hey, it's the Guide of the Perplexed. I'm not sure I'd be doing my job if you didn't leave at least a little bit perplexed. But if you have questions that maybe can be answered, I'll try to maybe answer them. Michael.
If no one has anything else to say, I'll say this. You mentioned that he didn't believe in atoms. So I just want to make it's about atoms. Atomic theory derives from the philosophy of Epicurus. And Epicurus was a true atheist. And atomic theory was always related through the ages with determinism and atheism. Spinoza was absolutely an opponent of atomic theory. In fact, Spinoza is in constant debate with Robert Boyle, the brilliant and religious chemist in Cambridge, I believe, or Oxford, I think it's Cambridge, who was actually doing the experimental work, which is the foundation of modern chemistry, which established the idea of atoms. But Spinoza's fighting him every step of the way because atoms is associated with with atheism. And atoms didn't become real in people's minds. So they were kind of something that seems to make sense in a kind of a formal way. But atoms didn't become real in people's mind until, and I wish Ed Golden were here to discuss this, until Einstein's 1905 paper on Brownian motion. And so saying somebody didn't believe in atoms just put them in the mainstream, and only dedicated atheists would have accepted atoms prior to 17th century, even the 18th century. Put that out. I just said that because nobody else had anything to say.
Yeah, no, that's okay. Okay, so we'll go ahead and wrap it up here.